At 6:42 a.m., beneath frost-hardened leaves along a county access road, a maintenance worker noticed a purse where it should not have been, resting near a drainage culvert, stiff with cold, untouched by traffic, its contents arranged by gravity and winter, suggesting absence, time, and a question Ohio would carry for decades afterward. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The road cut through a low stretch of farmland outside a mid-sized Ohio town whose economy had thinned after manufacturing slowed. December had already tightened its grip in 2003. Corn stubble stood brittle in the fields, and the sky settled low and gray by mid-afternoon. The purse was logged, photographed, and tagged. Inside were a student identification card, a set of keys, and a folded grocery receipt dated 3 days earlier. The name on the card belonged to a 22-year-old woman who lived 2 miles away, close enough for familiarity, far enough for uncertainty. By noon, a missing person report became a recovery assignment, and the assignment became a case. The initial response followed routine. Deputies canvassed the area. Tire impressions were measured in frozen gravel. The culvert was checked for disturbance. Nothing suggested a struggle. No blood, no torn fabric, no displaced soil beyond what winter already hid. The purse itself was clean. It did not appear to have been dragged. The placement suggested it had been set down. That detail would anchor debate for years. She had last been seen leaving a seasonal job at a shopping plaza decorated with lights and wreaths. The week before Christmas always thickened traffic there, and store managers remembered her as punctual, quiet, and careful. Surveillance cameras showed her exiting at 9:17 p.m., coat zipped, scarf pulled high. She crossed the lot alone. Her car remained parked overnight, undisturbed, its interior holding nothing out of place. The keys in the purse matched the ignition. The weather mattered. That night, temperatures dropped below 20. Wind came off open land. Exposure would have been dangerous, but there was no sign she walked into fields or woods. Canvassing produced no eyewitness who saw her after the parking lot. A bus driver recalled a woman standing near a stop earlier that evening, but the description fit half the town. A gas station clerk remembered nothing unusual. The first week ended with no body, no suspect, and a map pinned with possibilities. Local papers ran cautious headlines. Family photos appeared beneath them, holiday smiles that made the season feel intrusive. Flyers went up at churches, diners, and the courthouse bulletin board. Detectives traced phone records and bank activity. There was none. Her last purchase matched the receipt in the purse. Autopsy hints would come much later, but early on, medical examiners advised patience, explaining that without remains, conclusions were speculation. Investigators reconstructed her routine. She lived in a rented duplex near a state route, shared with a friend who was home that night. She planned to attend a Christmas Eve service. Gifts were wrapped on her bed. Her calendar noted a New Year's trip to visit relatives. No history of running away. No debt. No known enemies. Interviews with coworkers revealed nothing more than ordinary frictions. A former boyfriend had moved out of state. His alibi checked out. By January, snow layered the fields, sealing what might have been trace evidence. The case shifted from urgency to endurance. Detectives filed supplemental reports, reviewed tips, and returned to the purse repeatedly. Its condition suggested it had not been outdoors long before discovery, raising the question of placement after searches had already begun. That implied a person with knowledge of the investigation's rhythm. Spring thaw produced more questions than answers. A search of nearby waterways turned up nothing. Cadaver dogs alerted once near a tree line, but excavation revealed only animal remains. The summer brought a lull. Files grew heavier. Officers rotated assignments. The case entered a quiet shelf life, marked by annual reviews and holiday reminders when families feel absence more sharply. Years passed, technology changed. In 2012, the department digitized cold cases. Her file gained a new index. Analysts re-entered timelines, plotted cell tower pings from surrounding phones, and noted a pattern. A vehicle registered to a local contractor had passed the plaza twice that night, consistent with work routes, inconsistent with his usual schedule. At the time, it meant little. Now it was a thread. The contractor had since been cited for unrelated offenses, nothing violent. He lived alone, worked odd hours, and knew the rural roads well. Investigators approached him carefully. He denied involvement. His story placed him home by 9. Records suggested otherwise. Still, evidence was thin. The case remained open. In 2018, construction unearthed skeletal remains near a creek bank 10 miles from town, wrapped in degraded fabric consistent with winter clothing. The location was secluded but accessible by service road. Forensic examination established a female in her early 20s. Dental records matched. The cause of death was exposure complicated by blunt force trauma, nonspecific, consistent with an altercation and abandonment. Time of death aligned with December 2003. The finding reset everything. Evidence lockers reopened. Fibers recovered from the fabric matched a synthetic used in work gloves sold locally. Soil analysis corresponded with the contractor's primary job sites. A warrant authorized a search of his former truck, long since sold but traceable. In its bed liner preserved in storage, analysts found hair consistent with the victim. The probability was high. The arrest came quietly. Local residents were stunned not by the drama but by the proximity. The contractor had waved at neighbors for years. The trial unfolded with methodical restraint. Prosecutors presented timelines, cell records, fiber analysis, and expert testimony on placement behavior. The defense challenged degradation and coincidence. The jury deliberated carefully. A conviction followed. The sentence reflected the law. There were no speeches. The family held a service between Thanksgiving and Christmas, choosing a date that acknowledged loss without spectacle. The town returned to routine. Files were archived with a final notation. The road by the culvert remains ordinary. Winter still comes early in Ohio. The purse no longer waits. Winter returned to Ohio with a consistency that felt personal to those who kept the case alive. Each December brought new snow over the same roads, the same courthouse steps, the same parking lot where the trail first went quiet. Detectives revisited the timeline with the patience of men accustomed to long careers, aware that time does not erase facts, it only buries them under routine. The victim's movements were fixed now, measured in minutes and receipts, but the space between her car and the purse remained unresolved, a short distance that had carried years of unanswered questions. The town itself aged around the investigation. The shopping plaza updated its storefronts. The duplex where she had lived changed tenants. Missing person flyers faded, were replaced, and eventually removed. Yet the file remained present, pulled down every November as the season tightened and families gathered. Officers annotated margins with new thoughts, marking what had been considered and what had not. The absence of spectacle made the case harder to keep alive. There were no dramatic leads, no public confessions, no sudden breaks that could justify headlines. Attention returned to the purse. Forensic methods had improved since 2003, and analysts believed the object could still speak. Trace evidence was re-examined under modern microscopy. Fibers clinging to the lining were cataloged again, this time with a broader database. A partial print, once deemed too smudged, yielded points of comparison when processed with updated software. It did not identify a suspect outright, but it excluded many. That narrowing effect mattered. Investigators expanded their view beyond the immediate vicinity of the plaza. They studied service roads, contractor routes, and seasonal work patterns. December creates legitimate reasons for people to be out late, delivering supplies, repairing heating units, plowing lots. Those reasons can also hide misconduct. The analysis produced a short list of vehicles that passed the area during the relevant window. Among them, one appeared twice, minutes apart, an anomaly against typical flow. The owner's background was ordinary on paper. He had lived in the county most of his life, worked for himself, paid taxes, and avoided attention. He was known to respond quickly to calls, even late at night, especially during cold snaps when furnaces failed. His familiarity with back roads and access points was thorough, learned over decades. At the time of the disappearance, he had logged a call near the plaza, then another farther out near open land. The route connecting them intersected the access road where the purse would later appear. Early interviews had not focused on him. In 2003, records were fragmented and the volume of tips was high. By the time his name resurfaced, he had adjusted his story, not dramatically, but enough to raise questions. Memory can dull honestly, but it can also sharpen defensively. Detectives approached with caution, documenting inconsistencies rather than pressing for admissions. They knew the danger of confirmation bias in a case this old. Public interest waxed and waned. Local journalists wrote anniversary pieces with restraint, avoiding speculation. The family remained private, declining interviews, choosing to grieve without performance. That choice limited pressure but preserved dignity. Within the department, leadership emphasized method over momentum. Cold cases are not solved by urgency but by endurance. When remains were discovered years later, the landscape dictated the pace of revelation. The creek bank lay beyond town, bordered by brush and a service road used by utility crews. Seasonal flooding had shifted soil, complicating estimates. Forensic anthropologists worked carefully, separating environmental damage from perimortem indicators. The conclusion was sober and limited. Death resulted from exposure following injury. The injuries suggested force but did not describe it. There was no elaboration, no narrative beyond what bone can say. Identification brought relief and weight. The case transitioned from missing to homicide, a procedural shift that reopened resources. Evidence collected years earlier was now relevant in ways it had not been. The purse placement theory gained strength. If the remains were 10 miles away, the purse had not been dropped accidentally. It had been left where it would be found. Search warrants followed logic, not impulse. Investigators requested access to storage facilities associated with the contractor. Among the items was an old truck bed liner removed years prior and kept as a spare. It was an unremarkable object, scuffed and dusty, but laboratory processing found hair embedded in its grooves. Mitochondrial DNA testing could not individualize, but it could include. The inclusion mattered because exclusion would have ended the line. Soil analysis connected the liner to the creek bank. The match was not absolute, but the probability was significant. Combined with cell data and root analysis, the pattern cohered. The contractor was arrested without incident on a cold morning that mirrored the one that began the case. There were no cameras, no statements, only paperwork and procedure. The trial moved slowly, respecting the age of the evidence. Prosecutors presented records, expert testimony, and a timeline that avoided conjecture. The defense challenged degradation and coincidence, emphasizing the absence of eyewitnesses and the passage of time. The jury listened, asked for clarifications, and deliberated longer than average. Their verdict reflected confidence in accumulation rather than any single piece. Sentencing acknowledged the years between act and accountability. The court recognized the harm done and the restraint shown in pursuit of justice. The outcome was final, lawful, and unadorned. Afterward, the town did not change. Roads were plowed. Churches held services. The creek ran as it always had. In the aftermath, detectives closed the file with annotations that spoke to process. What was learned was not dramatic. Persistence matters. Objects matter. Seasons matter. A purse left in winter can wait, but it does not forget. After the verdict, attention shifted away from the courtroom and back toward the quieter work that follows resolution. Files were audited, evidence was cataloged for long-term storage, and reports were finalized with language that avoided flourish. Detectives who had inherited the case late in their careers reviewed the earliest entries, noting how little the fundamentals had changed. A young woman went missing during a season defined by togetherness, and the absence rippled outward, shaping years of work that rarely intersected with public attention. The legal outcome closed one chapter, but the investigation itself became a reference point within the department. Training sessions used it to illustrate patience, the value of re-examining physical objects, and the necessity of preserving evidence even when immediate answers seem impossible. The purse, once an overlooked item on a cold roadside, became an example cited without drama. It demonstrated how placement, condition, and timing can speak when witnesses cannot. For the town, the resolution arrived without ceremony. There were no marches or public statements. Residents learned of the conviction through the local paper and brief television coverage that emphasized the age of the case and the steady work behind its conclusion. Reactions were subdued. Many had grown accustomed to uncertainty, and certainty arrived quietly without restoring what had been lost. Conversations at diners and barber shops acknowledged the shock but returned quickly to familiar concerns: the price of fuel, the weather forecast, the approaching holidays. The family's response remained private. They attended the sentencing and declined interviews. Friends described them as relieved but not celebratory, aware that justice does not reverse time. The choice to hold a small service between Thanksgiving and Christmas reflected that understanding. It allowed remembrance without intrusion, grief without spectacle. The date fell just before the solstice, when daylight is shortest, a fitting moment for reflection rather than closure. Investigators revisited the timeline one final time, ensuring that conclusions rested on documented facts. The contractor's movements on the night in question were reconstructed again, step by step, using call logs, fuel receipts, and route maps. The pattern held. The analysis of opportunity aligned with the physical evidence recovered years later. No alternative explanation fit as cleanly. The absence of sensational elements reinforced confidence. This was not a story of elaborate schemes or hidden networks. It was an encounter shaped by circumstance, access, and decision. Autopsy findings, limited though they were, had guided the final theory. Exposure following injury suggested abandonment rather than intent to conceal indefinitely. The creek bank, accessible yet remote, supported that view. Seasonal flooding explained the delayed discovery. Environmental factors accounted for degradation without introducing speculation. Each conclusion remained tethered to what could be verified, a discipline maintained to the end. The courthouse returned to its usual rhythm. Cases moved through the docket. The courtroom where the trial had taken place hosted routine proceedings, its wood paneling unchanged. For those who had sat through weeks of testimony, the space retained a quiet gravity, but for most, it was simply another room where law was practiced daily. That ordinariness underscored the nature of justice as a process rather than an event. Within the department, the case prompted a review of cold case protocols. Evidence retention policies were reaffirmed. Digitization efforts expanded. Partnerships with state forensic labs were strengthened. None of these measures were announced publicly. They were administrative adjustments intended to improve future outcomes rather than commemorate past ones. The lesson absorbed was practical. Time is an adversary, but it can be managed. The road where the purse was found remained unchanged. Maintenance crews passed it regularly, trimming brush and clearing ditches. No marker indicated its significance. To most drivers, it was another stretch of county infrastructure. That anonymity mattered. The investigation had never relied on mythologizing place. It relied on understanding how ordinary locations can intersect with extraordinary consequences. As years passed, the case receded into records. New detectives learned of it through summaries rather than lived experience. The original investigators retired, carrying with them a sense of completion uncommon in long careers. Solved cases do not erase the weight of others left unresolved, but they provide a measure of balance, proof that persistence can eventually align facts into clarity. Seasonal cycles continued to frame memory. Each December, local media ran smaller features about community events rather than anniversaries of loss. The absence of repetition suggested a collective decision to move forward without forgetting. The story had been told, resolved, and placed where it belonged, in the archive rather than the present. The contractor began serving his sentence, removed from the rhythms of the town he had known. There were no statements from him that altered the record. The legal system did not require confession once evidence had spoken. His future narrowed to routine, mirroring the quiet consequences of choices made years earlier. The law addressed his actions without embellishment. In the end, the case stood as an example of restraint. No supernatural explanations were entertained. No exaggerations filled gaps. Each step adhered to procedure, respecting both the victim and the process. The outcome was not dramatic, but it was sound. Justice arrived not as a spectacle, but as a conclusion reached through accumulation, patience, and respect for fact. Winter still comes early in Ohio. Lights still appear in shop windows. Families still gather and count empty chairs. Some absences are permanent, but answers can arrive even after long silence. This case proved that time does not absolve, and quiet work can still speak when winter finally loosens its hold. The closing phase of the case unfolded without ceremony, reflecting the tone that had defined it from the beginning. There were no press conferences marking the end, no extended commentary from officials, only a brief statement confirming the conviction and the sentence. The restraint felt appropriate. The work had never been about attention. It had been about finishing something that had waited too long to be finished. Records were sealed where required and archived where permitted. Evidence was logged for retention according to statute, with particular care given to items that had bridged decades. The purse, now inert and fully documented, was returned to the family. It carried no mystery anymore, only memory. The decision to release it was administrative, but it carried weight. Objects can outlive questions, and when they do, they become personal again. The investigation's procedural review identified no misconduct, no shortcuts taken in desperation. Early assumptions were documented, later corrected. The gaps were acknowledged. The case demonstrated how limits in one era become opportunities in another. Techniques that did not exist in 2003 became decisive years later, not because of innovation alone, but because evidence had been preserved long enough to meet them. Local law enforcement leadership used the case to reinforce patience among younger officers. Cold cases were not presented as puzzles to be cracked, but as responsibilities to be carried. The emphasis remained on documentation, chain of custody, and revisiting what seemed settled. The lesson was quiet but durable. Facts do not age the way people do. For the community, the resolution settled into routine. The holidays returned each year with the same mix of familiarity and loss. Churches filled on Christmas Eve. The courthouse closed early on Christmas Day. New Year's fireworks briefly lit the winter sky. None of these traditions changed because one case ended, but the knowledge that it had ended altered something subtle, an undercurrent of unfinished business finally addressed. The victim's name appeared less often in print. When it did, it was framed in context rather than mystery. She was remembered as a daughter, a coworker, a student, a person whose life had been interrupted rather than a symbol of danger. That shift mattered. It restored proportion. The story no longer needed suspense to justify attention. The convicted man's appeals followed the expected path and were denied. Each ruling reaffirmed the evidentiary foundation. The legal language was precise, unemotional, and final. The process underscored the system's capacity to act slowly and still arrive where it must. Justice did not require speed. It required correctness. Rural roads continued to cut through open land. The creek bank where remains were found healed under vegetation. Seasonal floods reshaped its edge again and again, indifferent to human history. Investigators understood that landscape as both witness and accomplice to time. Nature explains delay without intent. It complicates discovery without malice. In retirement, one of the detectives reflected on the case in writing, not for publication, but for personal clarity. He noted how often work is done without resolution, how rare it is to close a file that has followed you through years. The satisfaction was muted, tempered by the understanding that no outcome restores what was taken. Still, there was value in completion. The town's archives added the case to a long list of resolved matters, each representing a different era. Paper files gave way to digital records, but the essentials remained the same. Names, dates, locations, conclusions. The accumulation of such records is how communities remember without reliving. As another December arrived, snow dusted the same fields and roads. The access road looked no different than it had decades earlier. Maintenance crews passed it without knowing its history. That anonymity was fitting. The case had never belonged to the road. It belonged to the careful work that traced a life's last hours and refused to let them dissolve into rumor. The story ended where it began, in winter, but with clarity instead of uncertainty. The investigation proved that even quiet cases can endure long enough to be heard. It showed that persistence, grounded in procedure, can outlast the seasons. And it left behind a record that did not seek to haunt, only to stand as fact, complete and closed.